I started to see that looking at us aesthetically, we might look fit and ripped and have six pack abs, but underneath, like you mentioned, underneath the hood, you pop that up, like you can see your blood tells you a different story sometimes.
Sports science, strength and conditioning, high performance coaching. Welcome to the Decoding Excellence Show. Today's episode of the Decoding Excellence Show is brought to you by VOD Performance, the makers of the Nordboard, the Dashboard, and the Groin Bar. Whether it's return to play, rehabilitation, or performance testing and training, VOD Performance has the tools you need. So who's actually using VOD Performance technology? I don't know, something like 14 NFL, 19 NCAA, 15 English Premier League, 7 English Championship, 5 NBA teams, and 6 MLB teams. They have the tools you need to get the best out of your athletes. Check them out at vodperformance.com. Welcome back to the Decoding Excellence Show. This is part 2 with Katie Mark. If you haven't listened to part 1 of this episode, please go back, listen to the show. It was an incredible show. Katie talked about everything from the gut microbiome, hydration and sport drinks, to exercise-induced muscle cramps. It was chocked full from start to finish with high-quality materials that not a lot of other podcasts and other nutritionalists are talking about. But part 2 in Katie Mark's show today, we start to get into the weeds about a lot of other things as well. We start talking about the differences between fit and unhealthy, and sometimes how athletes can be incredibly fit for competition, but underlying when you're looking at blood markers can be entirely unhealthy. Katie then goes into discussing periodized nutrition, how different macro and micronutrients are important at different seasons and different phases of high rigorous training schedules. And then she gets into the discussion of high protein diets, the myths, the facts, the realities of it, and starts really debunking some of the research out there and really goes into it. It was a fascinating conversation, and I really took a lot away from what Katie Mark shared on the second half of this show. Towards the end of this thing, we start talking a little bit about some of the lessons that she's learned from mentors and her experiences working within Rio for the Rio Olympics 2016. And again, I cannot thank Katie Mark enough for coming on the show and really setting a high bar for the other nutritionalists and people coming onto this show. She was prepared, and it was incredible from start to finish. So a little bit of a different show. I sit back, I take notes, I don't ask so many probing questions because Katie really just stole the spotlight on this thing, and she was on a roll, and I just wanted her to keep going. So please enjoy the next hour and 15 minutes of the Decoding Excellence Show. Grab a pen, grab a paper, get prepared to take some notes because this thing was incredible. So without further ado, here is my conversation, part 2 with Katie Mark. And welcome back, the Decoding Excellence Show. I'm joined with Katie Mark, and we are on what is otherwise the second half of the show. And if for the listening audience, if this is the first half of what you're listening to, then I would suggest that you go back, listen to part 1, because you're going to be missing out on a number of different great topics that Katie discussed, which is and way more in detail than what I'm going to summarize here, but certainly just the importance of the gut microbiome and how that impacts athletic performance and how you can get a better understanding of that as far as fueling and real food strategies to promote a healthy gut environment. Certainly, Katie shared a tremendous amount of information as far as sport drinks and hydration, and I use the word sport drinks with air quotations around it. But really, should athletes actually have sports drinks? Are there better rehydration strategies? And Katie discusses a lot of that in the first half of the show. And then we started to talk about sort of muscle cramps and exercise-associated muscle cramps and the science or lack thereof of actual science to it. and some of the research and some of the products out there that is actually sort of combating this thing. So if you haven't listened to the first half of the show, go back, download it via iTunes or elsewhere, your podcast listening of choice, and listen to it because it's an amazing first half of the show. But for all those that are now joining us in part two, again, Katie, welcome back to the Decoding Excellence Show.
Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it. Part one, I know is a lot of information, but it was all great information. And thanks for the intro. I really appreciate it. So for those who haven't listened to part one, just briefly a little bit about me. I graduated from Tufts last December with 2 master's degrees, a master's in nutrition communication and a master's in public health. Then moved back to Miami, where I was born and raised. And so I've been working part-time as a research and development consultant for nutrition, so various nutritional companies. Also work as a sports nutritionist and a writer in sports nutrition. Some of my work's even ghostwritten. So doing a lot of that and also training a lot as a competitive cyclist. I train about 10 to 15 hours a week, which kind of cuts into my work. But it's all, my training also helps, being a sports nutritionist and being able to apply the science. Before, a lot of this that I'm doing right now, it's also before I'm starting a dietetic internship this summer, because I'd like to become a registered dietitian nutritionist, so I could start working in pro sports. And I'm really excited. My dietetic internship is through a program called Wellness Workdays, based in Boston. And I'm actually focusing on sports nutrition and entrepreneurship. And I've got some really cool rotations lined up for 6 to 7 months of 1,200 hours of work. So I'm really excited. I'm going to be working with the registered dietitian for University of Miami Athletics. And I'm also got a great opportunity to go out to Colorado and work with one of my favorite sports dietitians, Bob Siegelhar. He was the former director of sports nutrition at the University of Florida. He was also a sports dietitian for the U.S. Olympic Committee. He's a phenomenal sports dietitian, and I'm really excited to go out there and maybe hopefully tour the U.S. Olympic Training Center. That would be really cool. Also, I'm really excited. I have a rotation early 2018 working with the Miami Marlins and a registered dietitian under her supervision with the Marlins. So that I'm really, really excited. And I'm hoping by early 2018, I'll be a registered dietitian and I can start jumping straight into doing sports nutrition at the pro sport level. Hopefully in 2018, as well as once you're completed and you've tested that, you're starting to answer interviews for, professional and collegiate sport programs, because they'd be crazy after the first half of the show, and obviously the materials you've shared on both Twitter and Instagram and elsewhere in the papers you wrote, they'd be crazy not to hire you. I hope so. Right? That's the plan. That's the plan. For the listening audience that missed it in episode in the first half, it's again, I referenced your Twitter and your Instagram, but it's at @onyourmark_NUTR for nutrition and On Your Mark Nutrition for your Instagram account. And I would imagine that if you type that in, that you'd be able to find your resources and appropriate links to your pages and backgrounds and probably LinkedIn and everywhere else. So thank you again for the update for those of the audience that didn't get to listen to it. And I'm excited for part 2 of this show, because you're going to discuss a couple different things that I think when we look at the world of collegiate athletics, that we see time and time again, athletes that, and which will be sort of the first, hopefully, topic that we can go into. Athletes, by all account, if we were to say that the eye test, if you will, that appear every little bit of fit, whether it's aesthetically or else, but might underneath the skin, when we start to assess the blood and we start to look at different biomarkers, might be anything but fit. So I'd love for you to jump in on that and kind of know from your educational experience and professional pursuits here what you think when it comes to
athletes? Are they fit? Are they unhealthy? Where does that stand for you?
So yeah, this is a really, really important topic. And I was interested in this a long time ago, or a few years ago, when I started doing blood analysis and blood testing, not just on myself, but for different athletes and testing for certain biomarkers, because I started to see that, looking at us aesthetically, we might look fit and ripped and have six-pack abs, but underneath, like you mentioned, underneath the hood, you pop that up, like you can see your blood tells you a different story sometimes. And so there was a great paper that was published recently titled Athletes Fit But Unhealthy. And I'm going to, give the correct contribution to Paul Larson. He's an applied sports scientist and physiologist, and he specializes in endurance performance. He was one of the authors in the paper. And this paper really resonated with me in terms of not only further solidifying my nutritional philosophy, but just really seeing it published out there, how there's such a need to address this. And pretty much the observation is that, we see athletes who are fit but unhealthy, and we see that unhealthiness, through biomarkers, through blood testing, through bone mineral density. And this is not just athletes at the pro level or the elite level. I mean, this includes collegiate, this includes recreational, avid weekend warriors who train like athletes. A lot of times you may look fit, but you can be unhealthy. And I think this is really important to educate people, what are the definitions of fit and healthy? And they have very different meanings. Specifically in taking it from the paper, fitness is the ability to perform a given exercise task, and health explains a person's state of well-being. And in that well-being, you want your physiology and all your systems in your body to work together in harmony. So as you can see, there's big differences between the two. And I think that a lot of the times we have this superficial interpretation of what it means to be fit and what it means to be healthy. And a lot of people will see athletes as fit and healthy, but many aren't. You'll see that a lot of athletes will have high triglyceride levels or high fasting blood sugar, insulin, and all of that's going to predispose you to certain diseases. And athletes aren't immune to chronic disease. They just like the general, population, there's certain risk factors that still apply to them. Adam, I think, Ryan Horn out of Wake Forest, strength and conditioning coach, but I think we had a tweet exchange one time because he had the same, observation that a lot of his athletes, even though they have six-pack abs, they don't realize that, when it comes to diet, what they eat, obviously impacts, their health status inside the body that they don't see. And really, it's this idea that, you can be fit, but from unhealthy training and or an unhealthful eating combination, that's going to make you unhealthy on the inside. And so really it's, this excess high training intensity or training volume and, or excess of intake of like processed and refined dietary carbohydrate, they can really contribute to poor health in athletes and in the long run, impair their longevity. And just as a side note in relation to this, when talking about processed and refined dietary carbohydrates, don't get me wrong, carbs are important for an athlete, especially obviously at higher intensities. But I'm seeing a lot of the times, and this is really through social media, I've seen how some of these, whoever it is, either sports nutrition departments or, maybe it's students that are doing it, or I don't know, dietetic students or, strength and conditioning coaches, whoever it is working or fueling athletes. Sometimes I see the foods that they're using to fuel athletes, and it's like this processed stuff. Like, it's just, I feel like maybe I'm wrong, but their take on it is that, we just need to get them energy and sugar so that they can, train. But it's really not considering the context of, their fueling. Sometimes you don't need, like if an athlete's eating before they go train, they just had lunch 2 hours before their training. Like, why do they need to eat more, especially, junk food or some of these processed foods right before training? Is it really necessary? And this kind of goes back into a deeper topic where, which I'll kind of touch upon later on, is this whole, improving metabolic efficiency. And so, this is where this high volume and or high intensity training, as well as the modern diet, which a lot of athletes, focus on this highly processed and refined carbohydrate. And, sometimes it's promoted among certain nutritionists or coaches, whoever. And it's really, in a way, contributing to an unhealthy athlete. Because in so many ways, this, highly processed and refined foods, it's poor nutrition, and this can cause increased inflammation in the body. It can also, impair your ability to burn fat for fuel, which is really important. And, all these forms of sugar, which athletes, may believe is necessary for better performance. And of course, depending on the context, it is. But that's not always the case, 100% of the time that you're exercising. And so this modern diet, really can lead to poor health. And like I said, in the short term, it's going to, produce inflammation. It's going to impair your ability to burn fat. It can increase, free radicals in your body. So oxidative stress. And over time, this is going to, lead to chronic inflammation, and that's going to associate with reduced health. But not only that, there's other dietary factors that really contribute to this, like excess alcohol. Omega-6 consumption is pro-inflammatory. So having too much of that compared to omega-3s, which is anti-inflammatory, the trans fat, and not just diet, but lifestyle factors, the stress. So different types of stress, that's also including psychological stress, excess exercise. All of this is going to contribute to chronic inflammation. And really, that's where it comes down to where, we have athletes who are fit, but they're unhealthy. And it's because of all these things that I previously discussed. And so it's like, okay, what do you do from here? What's the goal? And, this is where I, incorporate into my nutritional philosophy, not just for myself, but, in my work is, I want to improve, obviously, the performance of an athlete. And there's certain foods that are going to help that, certain carbohydrates. Like, if you're doing a really hard, or long run, maybe, having sugar in the form of, some processed food that wouldn't be good for you if you weren't training at that intensity. That would be appropriate under certain circumstances. But, my goal is to improve health while increasing fitness. And that really comes down to diet. Obviously, the training part, the high training volume and intensity, that's obviously not my I don't think that's really my scope of practice. I would leave that to coaches. But in terms of diet, focusing more on replacing highly refined carbohydrate with healthy natural carbohydrate. I like to focus more on fruits and foods in their wholesome form. And, healthy fats and plenty of protein, which I'm a huge advocator of protein, which I'll talk about later on. But all these things, and there's really cool ways to manipulate, especially related to carbohydrate intake, manipulation to help improve fat burning and improve certain biomarkers that are important for metabolic health. So really going off of that, my goal is to, especially since, this need of where we're seeing that athletes are fit but unhealthy. Actually, I'm just going to throw out a quick example. I had an athlete who, not like lean. She's lean, great shape, has abs, works really hard and is fit. But then when she got her blood tested, she saw that her fasting blood glucose was near pre-diabetic levels. And you look at this athlete and you're like, you got to be kidding me. Like, there's just no way you are pre-diabetic. I mean, there's just no way. And that was really, what was really fascinating was that instigated a behavior change in the athlete, because it was this fear like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. now I need to do something about it. Now I need to listen to you. And you see this difference because, athletes are not immune to these problems. And, so obviously the hard part is, how do you get the athletes to make a change? And it really comes down to behavior change. And some of the ways you can do it is by showing them data in their body, blood analysis, looking at different, like cortisol levels, testosterone levels, bone mineral density, all these different things that are going to tell you a different story and really can motivate an athlete to make a change. And so that's really what I focus on. I really think that optimal performance, I think sometimes, in terms of, I know you've seen this all the time, Adam, in sports nutrition, it's always focused on fueling the athlete. And you look at the fuel, and a lot of times it's just, it varies, but a lot of times.
Poor fuel.
Yeah, it's very poor fuel. And don't get me wrong, athletes need energy and they need certain things, but I really think we need to take a step back and look at the athlete holistically and really break it down in terms of context of, every single training session, every day, and the differences in needs, so that we can then optimize their diet. So that in the end, optimal performance is really athletes who are fit and healthy.
Yeah. And
this is really going to help their overall health and longevity in addition to performance.
What resonates with me on that is a number of different things, but a lot of the times when we have athletes, as they go through sort of the onboarding here from freshman to senior year, and they are leaving with the like their degree in hand and hopefully some championship rings in the other, that as they go through their career, I think what's sort of common to think about is that, especially in the collegiate world where, there's always another level of recruits coming in, is that you would think that very sort of unholistically, you would think that, it's a churn and burn sort of situation where they should be leaving worse. But what we found is that when we go through lifestyle and nutritional education and intervention to help promote recovery, a lot of the times our juniors and seniors feel better than when they did their freshman year. And while their bodies might be older and they might have a little bit more mileage, a lot of our athletes at that time really turn a corner because they start to understand how much nutrition plays an importance when it comes to the management of inflammation. A lot of the times the freshmen, as they walk into our facility, never really know how good their body's even supposed to feel because of the overconsumption of, low nutrient dense foods and high omega-6 and pro-inflammatory foods and poor sleep or an increase of alcohol intake as they sort of leave the nest and actually come to college for the first time, poor nutrition and intense training. It's almost the perfect storm to set them up for, inflammatory responses and an inability to ever really fully recover from one intense, especially in the intensification from going from one level just to the collegiate world. But you combine that with the perfect storm of poor nutrition, and we're digging a hole that they're never able to actually climb out of. And then secondly, what really surprises me, and you said it, you alluded to it in that discussion, was just the idea of, while it's important to fuel athletes, and we want to fuel athletes, we have to sort of understand what the quality of fuel is. And while athletes are trying to reach a certain threshold from a calorie standpoint, it reminded me, when you were talking about poor fueling strategies, it reminded me of like Dwight Howard a couple years ago when he was still with the Lakers, and it famously wrote, I think it was an expose or an ESPN article, but it talked about how his fueling strategy to reach the calories he needed to was like 24 candy bars a given day. And the negative consequences from a nerve standpoint and from an inflammatory response to those simple sugars and overconsumption really was breaking his body down. And as that organization started to change what he was eating and his fueling strategies and reduce some of those simple sugars and some of that consumption of poor nutrient foods, not only did his body respond, he felt healthier and a little bit more robust and resilient to injuries. So a huge critical piece as far as the promotion of athlete wellness can be tackled through a focus of what we're actually consuming and how we're actually consuming it.
Right. And I don't mean to interrupt, but just because you mentioned the Lakers, I love that you mentioned that, because I really want to highlight the strength and conditioning coach there, Tim DeFrancesco. He has done a phenomenal job. He does a lot of their nutrition, and I follow him on social media. I really recommend people follow him. I love what he does. I love his nutritional philosophy, and he's done a really great job with the Lakers. And I mean, to me, like, that's really awesome to see that a strength and conditioning coach like him really stays up to date on, nutrition and proper food fueling. And really, I think he's done a good job with the Lakers. So it's just funny that you mentioned that, because I know he was involved with that whole Dwight Howard thing. And so, yeah.
As far as a performance standpoint, and, I know there's 800 different definitions and titles that we all call ourselves, but we all share a responsibility in the education, or at least compliance, or at some basic level, some foundational level, about what the athletes are consuming. And the many touch points that we can have in an athlete's day, whether it's in the gym or it's on the practice court, or if it's in a one-on-one session, or if it's in the cafeteria. I mean, if we're all considering at trying to, influence positive performance, then I think we all sort of owe it to an athlete to do our very best work in all the modalities and transdisciplinary foci that we have to increase performance.
I agree 100%.
This might be a good time to start thinking about sort of our next topic that I'd love to discuss, which is, I think, the hardest part, perhaps, of nutrition. And that is, as we start to understand what to eat and how to fuel and sort of the right approaches, the approach that we might take for one team will drastically maybe different from a calorie standpoint from another team based on what the biodemands of that sport is, or positional demands. But at an even deeper focus, the individual plans. And I think once we start looking at sort of, well, how do we periodize out? How do we focus and individualize and tailor the nutritional sort of plans that we have? That becomes a little bit more of a challenge. And I think it takes a greater attention and maybe a more of a team base, something like a registered dietitian coming in to work with a program that might just exceed the skill sets, the scope, and the expertise level of all the various other sort of transdisciplinary team that you have. So I would love to hear a little bit more about sort of what a periodized nutritional plan looks like, at least whether it's in collegiate or professional, or even sort of an individual plan.
Yeah, no, you hit it on the head. It is hard to do, more individualized nutrition in certain settings, like team settings, like basketball or football or soccer or whatnot. But it's really needed. And there's this concept, and I've been doing this for quite a few years, called periodized nutrition. And essentially it's nutrition periodization tailored to training periodization. So periodized nutrition is, you use strategies to combine your exercise training and nutrition with the ultimate goal of, getting certain adaptations that are going to enhance your exercise performance. And so when you periodize your nutrition, your nutritional intake is going to change in response to different periods of your training. So, as in, athletes training, we have macro cycles, microcycles, mesocycles, and all those different things have different energy requirements, and even recovery requirements, nutritionally. And so going off of this, one of the goals, or a couple of the goals under periodized nutrition, how I see it is, fueling for the work intended. So that's a real simple way that you can explain to an athlete how, obviously your trainings and your different, even day-to-day variations are going to require different fueling strategies. And also under this, I see the concept of improving metabolic efficiency, which is really a coined term by Bob Seebuhar, who I mentioned earlier, phenomenal sports dietitian. And essentially with metabolic efficiency is that you're trying to be a better fat burner, and you're trying to use as much fat as you can up until a certain exercise intensity before you have to switch to carbohydrate. And this is really important because, and I really highly recommend that people read Bob Seebuhar's book, Metabolic Efficiency Training, because it really explains this very well very simply, especially for athletes, they could read this. But really, you're trying to manage your blood sugar, and you're using different food combinations to do so. And the point of this is to get you to rely less on simple sugars during training or competition, and really getting your body to become more efficient at burning fat at higher training intensities. And really, the great health effects of this is that it's going to help reduce risk factors for certain metabolic disease, in this case, like type 2 diabetes. This is going to help, have better fasting blood sugar levels, more sustained energy, and lower your calorie needs per hour during exercise, and even body fat loss. And essentially with this, you're using different nutritional strategies that are essentially focused around manipulating carbohydrate intake. But really, this is so important to incorporate this. And it really goes down to individualized nutrition, obviously. And don't get me wrong, this is not a high fat, low carb, high carb only or high fat type of diet. This is where it's not black or white. I really don't see nutrition like this. And, I used to be, as an example, I was very big into the high fat, low carb, or the ketogenic lifestyle. And I was ketogenic for six months. And I really believed in it because, being an endurance athlete, I wanted to rely less on sugar when I'm doing these 100-mile rides. I wanted to be focused on, being good at burning fat. And it's, some people might say like, oh, but that's really more so for endurance athletes. If you're a basketball player, like, you need the carbs or whatever. But I really think being able to be metabolically efficient is for everyone, because even at rest and at lower intensities, you want to rely more on burning your fat. Rather, you want to spare your muscle glycogen, your liver glycogen. So really, it's for all type of athletes. But, this goes back to this constant fight we see in sports nutrition of high carb versus high fat. And like I said, I used to be a proponent of high fat, low carb, but I moved away from it when, in all honesty, when I read about metabolic efficiency training and how really it's gray. It's a gray mix of carbohydrate and fat. It's really not black or white. And this is really emphasized through periodized nutrition. Because there are benefits to high carb and benefits to high fat. Obviously, at really high intensities, if you're going to go sprint 100 meters in the Olympics, carbohydrate is important. But, in certain trainings, you can decrease the amount of, carbohydrate you intake and become a better fat burner, and especially important in certain sports. So with this, periodized nutrition is really cool to me. And one of the things, I don't know, Adam, if you've seen this on my Twitter, but I talk a lot about train low. And I just love the concept of train low. It's pretty much, it's a term to describe training with low carbohydrate availability. So this means like muscle glycogen or low liver glycogen or a low carb intake during or after exercise. And this really is, the goal is to help get training adaptations to improve your performance. And one of them being better at burning fat during exercise, and also improving blood glucose levels. And there's all different ways to train low. And, I use it as an endurance athlete, but I think it's applicable to anyone. Some of the ways are to train fasted or train twice per day. So you can train in the morning and then have little to no carbohydrate, and then train at a lower intensity in the afternoon. You can train with low carb intake during, long training exercise. And there's a concept of sleep low. So training late in the day and then going to bed with carbohydrate intake that's restricted. And really, I just love these different methods. And it really comes down to how incorporating them is really important, because it comes down to the periodization of an athlete's nutrition. And obviously, these different things like train low is not only just one of them, which has, like I mentioned, all different types of strategies under it, but there's also train the gut, which Asker Ukendrup, who I talked about earlier, the purpose of that nutritional strategy is to allow for faster absorption of carbohydrate and reduce GI distress. So you would do that during training. Also train high. So training with high carbohydrate availability, training dehydration, or even improving training adaptations by using certain supplements. So nitrates, dietary nitrates, especially from beetroot juice, is a perfect example. And so these are just different nutritional training methods under periodized nutrition that are really, really cool. And it really takes knowing the athlete. And because, it's not that it's hard to incorporate, but it's not like it's super easy, like saying, hey, go eat some carbs so you can, replenish your muscle glycogen, right? You actually have to periodize that nutrition, and you have to incorporate the train lows or the training the gut during certain things in your training calendar, and that goes back to, what's your macro cycle? What's your microcycle? What's your mesocycle? Like all these different things. And what are the athlete's goals, And so even with this periodized nutrition, which if you're really interested in, I highly recommend reading Asker Ukendrup. He came out with a paper, periodized nutrition for athletes, like a few months ago, and it's done phenomenally. You see it on social media all the time, and it's really a great outline of it all. But there's still, he even says it, there's some unanswered questions, like how many days per week do you implement these nutritional strategies? What should the intensity or duration be when you're using some of these? Like as an example, when you're training fasted, after how many weeks are you going to see these effects? And so to me, as a sports nutritionist, as well as an athlete, because I implement these nutritional strategies, I understand the perspective and what you have to consider as a, sports nutritionist working with an athlete, what things you have to consider when you're going to implement this into an athlete's training plan. So as an example, which relates to training low and specifically training fasted. So, training after early in the morning after you were sleeping in a fasted state and not eating anything before training. One of the things I consider is obviously you should go at a lower intensity. But if I was going to incorporate this train low, I also consider the environmental conditions. So let's just say, as an example, I say, okay, Tuesday, this is going to be an easy day on the bike, and I'm going to do a train low strategy. Let's say on Tuesday, and I'm in South Florida, and I ride on an island, and wind happens to be a huge, huge factor. And even if you want to go easy, sometimes you can't, because if you're going against a 20-mile-an-hour headwind, it brings up the intensity of your workout when you didn't even intend to go at a higher intensity. So it's kind of funny because these are different factors I have to think about as a nutritionist and an athlete, being like, okay, is it worth it based on the environmental condition of that day and my training goal to train low, or is it really just going to hurt me? And so these are just, it kind of complicates the situation. But, if you're an athlete and you understand nutrition, or you're working with, as a nutritionist, you're working with an athlete and you understand the context of their sport and the different factors that can impact using these nutritional strategies, then, it really helps. So really the concept of periodized nutrition, to me, is very important. And it's something that I practice with myself and with the athletes I work with. And that really focuses on, and this is what I tell them, like, you need to change your energy demands every day based on what you're doing. As an example, you might look at a runner or a cyclist and say, like, okay, for that sport, you got to eat high carb, like, all the time. But really, no, you don't. You have to periodize your intake based on your training and the energy demands of that. And then this will help you health-wise by, making your metabolism more efficient. Because if you, like we discussed in the first part of the podcast, if you're constantly eating, a high carb diet and, let's say you have an easy recovery day, you're just doing, an easy workout, even for like an hour, and it's really not at a high intensity, you're still increasing your blood sugar, you're increasing your insulin when you really don't need to. And it's really, it's hurting you in your management of blood sugar. So these are just big picture things where it comes down to where diet is not the same every day. Take for consideration football players and their different needs, even based on positioning. And it's really, really important. And I think sometimes athletes don't think about this. And maybe even, people surrounding them, whether it's nutritionists or whoever, or maybe there's a lack of it, this education of really explaining the context of things and how you periodize your nutrition. Because I really think that not only is it going to help with training adaptations, which is one of the goals of periodized nutrition and these particular strategies I talked about, but it's really going to help with their overall health. Like I discussed before, no athlete's immune to disease. So that's really the goal with periodized nutrition, and that's why I really use it, and I love it. I think it's a great way to take sports nutrition and fueling to a whole different level.
Like in Asker's material, if you're unfamiliar with it, it is the site that you can find a lot of that is mysportscience.com. And his graphics, I think, not only the graphics, the visualization of them, but the material that he shares is easily digestible, which is sort of a pun, but an educational pun, if you will. But the materials that he shares are top notch. And from a periodized nutrition standpoint, I love the fact that we're tying in, the emphasis of training and the influence of what you're nutritionally intaking and how the two obviously work so closely together. And I think what's that's sort of contingent upon is the constant communication from a technical tactical standpoint, the physical development standpoint, and the nutritional team. Because again, if it's going to be, hey, Tuesday, we're going to go off course from a periodization standpoint, and we are going to have an intense 11 on 11, then maybe we need to do something in the preparation nutritionally for that practice a little bit differently than, say, if it was a scheduled recovery. So the communication, I think, between all the teams have to be very, very concise and very on board with it. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do here at Wichita State that I think is really important too is as an athlete's coming to the end of their collegiate career, just like you would have the onboarding of educational resources for an athlete as they're coming into their first competitive environment from a freshman standpoint, I do think it's contingent upon us to also educate what athletes need to do as they're coming to their end of their career and how they need to influence and change the nutritional intake that they have to match what their level of physical activity is going to be, especially if they're going from 20 plus hours a week of, intense physical activity to reducing that down to less than 5 or 2 or 1, or some of them, are getting out of athletics to pursue professional disciplines, that those calorie differences certainly change. And I think that has been, from a holistic standpoint, a well-needed educational intervention to help prepare these athletes.
Adam, I love that you just said that, because that's one of the things that I've done with some athletes. I call it nutrition detraining. You're right. They've gone from all these years of this, all these hours of training and different energy needs, and then they go into the real world, into a 40-hour week sedentary job, and it hits them like, oh my goodness, I can't eat the way that I did when I was an athlete. And it really hurts them because those were habits that were so ingrained, and those were, flavors of foods and everything that, you were so used to and so accustomed to, that it's so hard to get rid of that. And then they see weight gain and all these different health effects. And, I just have, one example. I've worked with a couple tennis players who played collegiate tennis. And, it's just funny, like when they're done and they're out in the real world, how I've seen them freak out about this. And, they can't go for the 400 calorie Starbucks latte anymore because they're not playing tennis like they used to. And it's a big problem. And they have no clue, because they weren't equipped with anything nutrition education wise on, okay, how do I change my eating habits that I've done for this even happened to me when I was a tennis player competing. Like my nutrition intake was obviously different than when I stopped playing, and I had a hard time realizing that. And I'm pretty sure I gained weight. And it's really, really important. And I call this nutrition detraining. And this is not only important for collegiate athletes, but look at professional athletes, especially those in the NFL, and how, oh my goodness, the differences that happen once they retire and they go and they're, I don't even know what they're doing in their retired life, but, let's say relaxing, and they're not training like they used to, they experience the same problem. And so that's one of the things that I do with athletes, because I get it. And it's very psychological too. And I call it nutrition detraining.
And I think all of that material that you shared has been well needed to be discussed. And maybe the last thing I wanted to kind of talk about as we sort of come towards the end of potentially hour 2 here is a topic that I think Brandon Marcello spoke about last year at the Seattle Sports Science Conference that Dave Tenney hosts out in Seattle, which is coming up here in a couple weeks, typically the second week of June here, but gave a tremendous topic conversation about sports nutrition and talked a little bit about protein in this discussion. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as far as how much protein the body can utilize, high protein diets in general, the effects of protein from a body composition standpoint, and just some of your thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, I love this topic. In fact, personally, I really think that protein should be the default macronutrient, especially for athletes. And I think when people think of protein, I feel like in a way they think that it's only for muscle protein synthesis. And I feel like, obviously, yes, but there's other functions of protein that are so important that your body uses it for. And it's not just going straight to your muscle. It's growth and maintenance. So obviously muscle and connective tissue. Protein's used in enzymes. It's used in hormones like insulin and glucagon. It's used a bit for energy, forming glucose from amino acids. Proteins are used in transporters in your gut. They're important in immune function, so they form antibodies. They're used as neurotransmitters. They help maintain acid-base balance and maintain fluid balance. So protein is so important in your body. And I think sometimes people forget, or maybe they don't know, it's not just going to your muscle. And so, we really do need a bigger intake of protein than I think we see in the American diet. And, this kind of goes to, okay, how high is high? And in all honesty, I've been an athlete who's focused a lot on high protein. But, I'll be honest, I didn't really know what specifically is a high protein diet. What is it really? Now, if you look at the recommended daily allowance, which the RDA, it's 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for protein. And really, this is not the optimal level. This is really just the minimum level. And, the definition of a high protein diet really has been considered, greater than like 15% of your total energy, and as high as 35% of your total calories or intakes, in regards to the RDA. But really, defining what a high protein diet is better done through explaining, daily per kilogram amount of body weight. So not percentage of total calories. The International Society of Sports Nutrition's position stand on protein, they even come out and say that protein intakes of 1.4 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for physically active individuals is not only safe, but may improve the training adaptations to exercise training. So if you look at that range of protein intake, and I know, others have said that, for endurance athletes, it should be like 1.2 to 1.4 grams, and for strength trained athletes, 1.6 to 1.7 grams. But for those who are like in intermittent sports, like basketball, it should be like 1.4 to 1.7 grams. But really the upper limit has been around like 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, as protein needs for athletes. And I'm going to talk a lot about Dr. Jose Antonio. He's a good friend of mine. He's awesome. I don't know if you follow him on social media, but he's great. And he is the CEO of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. He's also one of the leading researchers on high protein diets. And he's fantastic. He's an associate professor at Nova Southeastern University down in South Florida. And in regards to effect on body composition, I mean, a lot of the studies that I'm gonna talk about briefly here, it's really coming from him. In terms of body composition, a high protein diet can be favorable in helping the energy balance equation. And really, it can have a protective effect on preserving lean body mass during weight loss. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of athletes, Adam, who, they're trying to lose weight. And so they have this caloric deficit. And with that, you're going to lose muscle mass, which you don't want to do, because then you have to start all over again and build up your muscle. And studies have shown that if you increase your protein intake, you can still gain muscle mass even when you have a caloric deficit. And so, just briefly touching upon some of Jose Antonio's work, in 2014, he had the first study that showed a high protein diet study. It was the first one, and it was also higher in calorie. They didn't find a change in body composition when they did 4.4 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, which is very, very high. And they measured body composition and performance. And this is 5 times the amount, the RDA of 0.8. And they found no effect on body composition, so in resistance-trained individuals. And this was, at the point, considered a true high-protein diet. And, he did a follow-up study in 2015 using resistance-trained men and women. And the protein was 3.4 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And they combined this with, a periodized heavy resistance training program. And they saw a loss in fat mass, and there were also no side effects found. So this was showing it was favorable on body composition. And there was no effect on blood lipids or markers of kidney function. And so this is important research. And I feel like a lot of times when you see in the media about high protein and if you eat too much protein, it's going to lead to body fat. Well, we have studies right here that if you do a simple PubMed search, which any nutritionist or dietitian or whoever in science should be able to do, you can find these studies. And, even another study that he did in 2016, it looked at high protein diet on the health and body composition in resistance trained men. And it was actually the first randomized crossover trial for a high protein diet. And they found that even overfeeding on protein didn't have a negative effect on body composition. And, it's like, okay, so how does a high protein diet, how does that help body composition, or how does it not hurt body composition? And, one of the things is that, you can look at the thermic effect of exercise, so how much you're burning there. Then you can look at non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So examples of this would be like, walking around or, walking upstairs or, shaking your leg or whatever, things like that. And then also combining the dietary protein's thermic effect. So the burning of, from this feeding, the thermic effect of feeding. And for protein, it's between like 19 and 22, somewhere around there, percent of the protein that's burned just from, digesting protein. And if you compare that to carbs, the thermic effect of carbs is around 12 to 15%, somewhere around there. And then fat is like very low. I think it's around like 2%. So if you look at the thermic effect of protein, you're seeing that there's a greater caloric output. So you're burning more calories because of this protein intake. And not only that, but it's also a very satiating or filling nutrient. And this can help decrease, your food intake. So if you're trying to lose weight, which is very difficult because of appetite, which is psychological, the more satiating the nutrient is, then this is going to help you with having a lower food intake. And, going back to these studies, there was no change in blood lipids or kidney or liver function. And so it's really fascinating. And even in one of the studies, they looked further into two subjects that even went higher than the RDA by I think it was over 500% and even up to 700%. And they looked at that in relation to the kidney function, and there was no change in the kidney function. And so they suggested, there's no harmful side effects from this. And so really the study and Jose's studies really suggest that when you have this protein overfeeding, and even if you're increasing total energy intake, you're less likely to gain body fat. And if you're restricting your calories, it's going to help preserve lean body mass, which is obviously critical because you don't, want to lose weight and you want it obviously to come from body fat and not muscle mass. And so, essentially this is showing us that consuming protein well above the recommended daily allowance can really alter in a favorable fashion body composition, as long as you are training and you're exercising and you have an exercise training regimen. And in fact, he's now running another study on high protein diets in women, and I'm in the study. So I'm eating, let's see what I mean. I'm eating about 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein per day. And actually, even on a lot of my days, I've gotten above 3 grams. And so, I take in about 150 to I've reached up to, I think 240 grams of protein in a day. I'm averaging around 160. And let me tell you something, I'm noticing a big difference in body composition, and I'm not changing my carbohydrate intake. It's still around what I usually do because I periodize my carbs. And I'm really not changing anything. And I've noticed a huge, huge difference. And I don't look at scales because I could care less what I weigh. I care more about how I feel and how my clothes fit, because that's a better gauge in my opinion. And I can tell you right now, my clothes fit much better. And so, in his high protein studies, so now he's looking at women, and we're all resistance training. And I don't know, I'm not sure what else. I don't know if he could tell me what else he's looking at, because I actually don't even know if I'm in the control group or not. But anyways, but I think also he's looking at bone health and how it affects bone mineral density, which is another thing that I'm going to talk about. Because another concern with high protein diets is that, they can increase the amount of calcium that's excreted in your urine, and this can increase your risk for osteoporosis, and this isn't good. And really, this is not the case. And this idea or this myth behind it is because, some of the early studies were reporting, this increase in the acidity of your urine due to an increase in your dietary protein. And it appeared that there was a link drawing calcium from the bones in order to buffer this acid load. But really, the main source of the increase in your urinary calcium from a high protein diet has shown to be more of due to intestinal or dietary, and not from bone breaking down bone or getting it from bone. So ultimately, this bone loss hypothesis has really been refuted. And in fact, the National Osteoporosis Foundation, they came out with a recent review of dietary protein and bone health. It was a systematic review and a meta-analysis. And I'm going to give a shout out to my alma mater, Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition Science, because there was a lot of authors on this paper that came from Tufts, and they concluded there was no adverse effects of higher protein intakes on bone health. And in fact, in some bone sites, there was a positive trend on bone mineral density. And so, they even mentioned that increasing dietary protein had a significant increase in the calcium absorption in your intestine. And there was no increase in, skeletal breakdown in terms of getting calcium. And I kind of go with this. I'm really excited to see, I'm like I said, I've done high protein most of my life, but now I feel like this is, what I'm doing in the study is now a real high protein. And my bone mineral density when I tested up at Nova Southeastern was 2.2, a T-score of 2.2. So I was really 98 percentile. So my bone mineral density was higher, like 98 percentile of my bone mineral density. And like I said, I've been doing high protein for most of my life, and now it's even higher. And so it will be really cool within a year to see how this, even higher protein intake than what my body was used to will affect my bone mineral density. So I think that'll be really cool. I mean, granted, there's so many different things that will affect your bone mineral density, obviously strength training being one of them. That's why I really prioritize, resistance exercise. But really, it's coming down to, in terms of the myth regarding calcium, that there's no adverse effects in that sense. Now, could we have some randomized controlled trials that, go for a couple years? Yeah, let's see what happens then. But as of now, there's nothing to support that, it's bad for calcium levels and bone health. And kind of going off of this in terms of going on with these myths, and the reason why I really wanted to bring this up is because I've seen this a lot in social media recently and in health or, different magazines, I think more that are geared towards women. And Jose and I have really, kind of laughed, like we'll send each other some of these, high protein articles or tweets we see that are so against high protein and some of the things they say that has no science to back it. And, it's become a big thing recently that we're seeing. And, one of the myths is regarding the amount of protein absorbed at one time. And, some publications, have said that, maximum stimulation of muscle protein synthesis rate occurs, when you intake 20 to 30 grams of protein at one time. And I remember there was a tweet recently, I'm not going to get too much into it, but it stimulated a lot of controversy because the way that the tweet was phrased, and this was coming from a reputable source, it was phrased that you can only use 30 grams maximum at a time. And really, it's been shown in a study that you can actually still oxidize or burn protein, amino acids, at doses much higher than that. There was actually a study that found that taking in 40 grams of whey protein after resistance exercise stimulated a larger response in muscle protein synthesis compared to 20 grams. And this was in young resistance trained men. So essentially it was showing that 40 was better. And so really, to take away from this, the biggest thing is that, currently we don't know how much protein your body can use at one time. But for some odd reason, people are people are saying, 20 to 30 grams is what you can, absorb at a maximum and use at one time. And I think that's kind of something that's been said by people who maybe just want to, not promote a high protein diet. Really, we don't even know how much protein your body can use at one time. And kind of going into another myth regarding the kidneys, which I talked a bit about earlier in Jose's studies, and how they didn't find any detrimental effects on the kidneys. This myth is still around because, eating more protein is going to increase the amount of work that your kidneys do. So this increases the load on your kidneys, right? And so there's really no data that exists on this. And if you really ask someone like, hey, show me some research that shows in healthy people that too much protein will hurt their kidneys. And there's nothing to show that. Now, if you already have an existing kidney problem, that's a different story. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a healthy population. There's no detrimental effects on the kidneys. And like I previously mentioned in Jose's 3 studies up there was nothing. In fact, Stu Phillips, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's another great researcher. And he had a review that came out on higher dietary protein diets and weight loss, and specifically a focus on athletes. And he specifically states that, an examination of the statements that come from the Institute of Medicine with respect to the protein RDA in the United States, as well as the World Health Organization's report on protein intakes, there really is no evidence to link a high protein diet to kidney disease. So when you see this out in some health magazine, or you see a tweet that, oh, you shouldn't have high protein because it's going to the effect on the kidneys or whatever, there's nothing to back that. And this also leads me to, okay, so why is there so much misinformation about this in the media? And honestly, I don't even know. For instance, I've had conversations with Jose on this. Why are people stating this? And, I went and I looked back at some of my nutrition textbooks, and that same statement, regarding the kidney function was in there. And it's just really fascinating that, why is this information there? And misinformation. And, I've even asked some registered dietitians, for instance, because I was like, hey, look, I want to send you some of these studies to, regarding, high protein diet. And I'm just curious as to why, people, still promote these myths. And one of the things that was mentioned to me was, because, if an athlete increases their protein intake, then that means that they're probably going to have a lower carb intake. And we know carbs are really important for them. And, so when you have a higher protein intake, it's just going to replace their carb intake. And, I even told Jose this, and he was like, I kind of don't see it that way. And I don't see that either, because I think first and foremost, athletes love carbs.
Yeah, right. Typically, that's the first and probably easiest thing they reach for.
No, I'm pretty sure that's not the case. And even in his studies, his high protein studies, it was never a low carb component. The carb was just kept normally. So really, that's not if you have someone maybe who has an eating disorder and they're looking for fad diets and they see certain things on high protein and low carb, that's a different perspective. But I really don't think it's going to replace carbs in an athlete's diet. And so it's just really fascinating how we have all these myths, and a lot of it is being written, not a lot of it, but we've seen a lot of it written by people who really should know where to look if, regarding statements like that. And all it takes is a simple PubMed search of the research to figure out, okay, what is, the conclusion regarding the effect of high protein on kidneys, or the effect that it's going to have on our bone mineral density. And there's no research that states otherwise. And so that's why it's very confusing why we have this misinformation in the media. And it's kind of mind blowing. It really is. And I just don't understand it. Maybe certain people aren't keeping up with the research. I don't know. Or, they have ulterior motives as to why they're just so anti-protein when it's such an important macronutrient. And it, especially for the athlete who wants weight loss and maintains their muscle mass, it's so important, and it can help that. It's a protective effect. And so I thought this would really be important to just briefly touch upon these things and kind of hopefully steer it clear. And I hope if Jose is going to listen to this, he likes the job that I did at explaining. We have conversations on this all the time. And so he's like, yeah, I love that you're going to talk about this.
I know he has to at some point in time be listening and incredibly proud of the topics and your champion of this philosophy and this pursuit. Katie, I want to respect your time. I know I've stolen or have asked you to come on and share what is otherwise a lot of information. And I feel like in the time that we've spent together, that there is such a huge critical umbrella of a holistic approach to sports nutrition that not only helps athletes achieve the performance that they're looking for, but maybe more importantly, and certainly more importantly, achieve a holistic and well-balanced lifestyle outside of it. And it's setting them up for continued success and health and well-being outside of their athletic performance. And I think those two are more hand in hand than they are separate, especially with a well-rounded approach to sports nutrition. So, Is there anything that if someone was listening to this and whether it's high protein diets or periodized nutrition or cramping or, the philosophy around unhealthy fueling strategies for athletes and what they could do different, or hydration or sports drinks or the gut, is there any resources that you would want to point them to or ways that they can connect with you so that rather than sort of just being exposed to the idea of it, that they can kind of dig deeper and maybe ask you a little bit more specific questions?
Yeah, no, I'm always open to people asking me about these topics. I'm constantly up to date on, sports nutrition research, and this is my passion more so. Like, you'll see a lot of dietitians focus on like recipes and helping people, come up with recipes and all those things. But this is more my focus, the nutrition science, and digging deep into it, and more the applied science part, like taking what I see in studies and applying it in the real world and seeing, how we can make it practical. And so I would have no problem talking to anyone who would like to discuss any of these further. But even so, one of the biggest things that I find is so important, if an athlete or whoever wants to get information like this, that steps away from the whole, recipe side. But I think Twitter is such a powerful platform. And I've noticed that the sports scientists, whether, it's related to strength and conditioning or exercise physiology or nutrition, I really feel like the platform is the greatest thing to just troll on. I mean, not like troll on people, but like just read everything. I mean, and that's where all the PhD people, like all these really cool things, I see this through Twitter and I read it all the time and I just find it so fascinating. That's really, I would recommend, is more so than Facebook or Instagram or whatever, really just getting on Twitter and following certain, leading sports nutritionists and, all related to sports science, and see the studies that they're posting and their comments on it. And to me, that I've learned more than I could ever in a textbook. I mean, and it's really, really cool. And, one of the things, and I think you kind of hit this on the head earlier, that I like to do is obviously mention these studies, but I like to also show how I apply them and experiment. And I know one of the biggest things that I've done is with beetroot juice. And that's actually a lot of the work that I did in collaboration with Carl Valle, especially preparing his athletes for Rio 2016. And that was huge. And I did so much experimentation with that. And let me tell you, there's a lot of beetroot juice supplement companies that don't like me right now, because I literally would interrogate them, because at the end of the day, I work for an athlete. I don't work for a company. And I really want to see where, whether it's a supplement or whatever it is, really have the eye on helping the athlete and not just trying to make money. And you'd be really shocked, but there's a lot of really crappy, products out there, or, supplements, for ergogenic aids that really aren't great. And it really takes someone who knows the nutrition science to help an athlete, kind of figure out, okay, which is the best thing to go with. And so, even through Twitter, you can learn a lot about these things. And I don't know if you've seen this, Adam, but like I've interrogated companies on Twitter, and maybe I made them look bad, but I asked them questions and I drilled them. And it's, because I want an answer, because I want to be able to help the athlete. And I think those are things that you don't see like in a magazine article or, in sports nutrition textbook. This is like real life stuff. It's taking the science and applying it in the real world. And it's really cool. And so, if athletes did want more information on this, I would be more than happy to talk about it. And I would be more than happy to steer them in a direction of, certain people that they can read what they write on Twitter, as that's really a great platform for learning about all these things. And I've actually had athletes that I know and don't know that have reached out to me and been like, hey, I really love what you do on Twitter. Like, I love reading some of those things because I don't get that perspective from anybody else. So it's really cool to see that applied and, try to learn how I can apply it to myself as an athlete. And, just as an example, the whole train low thing. And so that's where I would say, if you wanted more information, it really is, coming from, these scientists that are talking on Twitter and applying the science and talking about it. So that's definitely my recommendation.
And for the audience, again, I know I mentioned it earlier in the show, you can find Katie on Twitter at onyourmark_NUTR. And I agree with you. I absolutely think it's a great playground to experiment, to learn, to get a better understanding of the various sort of disciplines and research and information each of these disciplines is sharing, and how they relate with each other, and how our performance team can continue to do what's right for the athlete. And, much like Carl, I love the fact that you hold them accountable to what their marketing claims are, because I do think that most likely companies hire a PR team or an advertising team or a marketing team, but at some level they do have to be responsible for the coaches and the athletes that they service. So, Katie, I know this was a long day for you, but I think it was a well-needed and a great start to laying the foundation for the Decoding Excellence Show. And I honestly feel like the next nutritionalist that comes on, whomever they may be, has incredible big shoes to fill, because this was a comprehensive, full picture approach to sports nutrition. And I just can't thank you enough for coming on.
No, thank you, Adam. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I want to thank Katie Mark for coming on the Decoding Excellence Show. I took a bunch of things away from part 2, and if you haven't listened to part 1, I highly suggest you go back, download the episode, and listen to part 1 as well. From discussions about the gut microbiome to sports drinks and do we really need them, or could we really get by without them, to everything from heat-related muscle cramps to even this show, which dives a little bit deeper into talking about what it means to be fit or unhealthy, and how we can start to do some blood analysis and get better understanding of why athletes need to be both fit and healthy. We start discussing periodized nutrition and how different macro and micronutrients are more important at different phases and times of the competitive annual cycle. Then we start to talk a little bit more about high protein diets and what that means, and what really constitutes a high protein diet versus a low protein diet. I took a lot away from this show, and I just cannot thank Katie Mark enough for spending and investing a couple hours with me discussing everything from athletic nutrition and what it means, and how athletes can harness their nutritional interventions and support to really get the best performance out of their bodies, and hopefully stand on the podium and accept a gold medal around their neck. I want to thank Katie for that. I want to thank our sponsors, VOD Performance, as well. And like always, the Decoding Excellence Show really aims to be a different show. We want to have conversations. We want to sit around the fire and have these intimate fireside chats and really get to understand what makes a coach tick, why they got into what they do, and how there's more similarities across all the professions and disciplines when it goes into elite performance. So like everything, we're diving deep into understanding what the tools, the tactics, and the tricks of high performance coaches, and what they do and how they do it and why they do it. If you've resonated with any of the materials in this show, please go onto social media, share this show on whatever platform of your choosing, and then log on to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. Your reviews on iTunes goes a long way for allowing other people that might be unfamiliar with the Decoding Excellence Show to being exposed to it. So it does help us move up in rankings, which only allows for us to get a little bit more exposure, which only allows for other coaches to find the show easier. So pay it forward, go onto iTunes, give a 5-star review, and start investing in the next class of high performance coaches.